Hello, today I'm talking about We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. This copy was translated by Natasha Randall, but I read it mostly on my Kindle, so all my quotes will be coming from this copy, which was translated by Clarence Brown. We was written in 1921, but it was banned by the Soviet Union from publication until 1988. Luckily though, it managed to escape and was first published as an English translation in 1924. Alongside Jack London's The Iron Heel, it's pretty much like a cornerstone of dystopian fiction, one of the earliest. It directly inspired George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, both of which I have videos on. Go check them out. The book takes place in the One State, which is a totalitarian regime run by the Great Benefactor. All of their laws are based on order and reason and mathematics and logic. Everyone lives in these big glass buildings, and almost every hour of the day is like scheduled for a particular activity. Nobody has names, they're all just numbers, and the only time they get a little bit of privacy is when they get a pink ticket, which means they can drop their curtains, you know, for sexy times. The story takes the form of a diary by number D503. D503 is the lead engineer and builder of the Integral, which is a spaceship that they're building in order to kind of spread the message of this perfect state to like other planets. On one of their customary marches, D503 meets a woman called I330, who is a complete dissident. She smokes, she drinks, she does all these things that are so illegal in the One State, and then gets away with it with their just network of people writing her fake doctor's notes and stuff like that. D503 falls in love with her, obviously, and she introduces him to this world outside of the walls of the city, and just tries to inspire in him something against the regime. I don't want to go too much into detail of the plot or what happens in the end, because I think the cool thing about this is definitely the premise. I thought it was a really interesting novel, but I didn't enjoy it. I wouldn't say it was like fun to read. I didn't care about any of the characters, and I did find it quite confusing. There wasn't enough kind of description of the world for me to actually be able to picture it, so I didn't understand a lot of kind of like the expectations of different parties. And suddenly D503 would be like in a panic and on the way to somewhere, and I have no idea like what he's actually trying to do. And also the parts of the book where there's like quite a lot of action, it's really vague what's happening. So yeah, I didn't exactly have fun reading it, but it was a really stimulating book. The first thing I want to talk about is, why is this dystopian and not utopian? All of the numbers are really happy with the regime. Like, they see it and it makes perfect logical sense to them. They live in a world governed by order, which is seen as being an evolution of like historical governance. I forgot to mention that this happens in the future. Basically, there's a 200-year war where everything ends up being a wasteland and most people die, but they do come up with some like miracle petroleum food something. So it is in the future of our timeline. I think it's like 1,000 years in the future or something like that. In the book, they historically reference things as being hundreds of years after the 200-year war, so it's a little bit vague. But yeah, they all truly believe that they have found like the happiest state that humans can be in, and that is one of uniformity and conformity. The instinct of non-freedom has been characteristic of human nature from ancient times. And like, I gotta give it to them, it sounds pretty good. I think it's entirely because we live in a world that values like individualism and creativity that we see this kind of arrangement as being so oppressive. But if your base values aren't like self-expression or whatever, then yeah, sure, permanent homogeneous happiness, what's wrong with that? Well, yes, a couple of things. Towards the end of the book-ish, there's this thing called the Great Operation, which is where the state is kind of losing control a little bit, and regain it with this thing called the Operation, which basically turns you into, it's like x-rays on the brain, and then you end up with like wheels instead of feet, and it basically is you're kind of a tractor of a human being. And I see that as the point where you can be like, oh right, totalitarianism isn't good, because homogeneity is a cop-out. If everything is the same, like what's the point in anything? And personally, that's how I determine value in the world, is that I say, okay, nothing has any meaning, therefore things have the meaning that I impound upon them. And the thing that gives us life and grit in the present age, I guess, is conflict. It's badness. We don't want to strive for eternal happiness because we wouldn't find eternal happiness without conflict. I think we can all agree that like endless happiness is a logical fallacy. When I finished the book, I was just reading up on it a little bit, and I didn't think about it while I was reading it, but now it makes a lot of sense, that we is kind of an argument against atheism, because essentially like deities and God in this book are sort of personified through the benefactor, but mostly they're just about like the concept of like logical organization. And the thing that makes deities is that they can't be reasoned. right? I have a lot of Christian friends and they say it's mostly like, it's a leap of faith. Faith is what you're doing. You don't have all the answers, but you just believe that that's the right way. And that doesn't work if they're just mathematical nothingness. There are all of these like whims and metaphors throughout the book of like why mathematics and logic tend towards perfection. But it's all just kind of bullshit, isn't it? I think Zamyatin is saying correctly that you sort of need ambiguity for that leap of faith. Anyway, another aspect that makes this not utopian is the kind of language that they use. There's a lot of like associating mental problems with like individualism and creativity. One quote is, "The way to rid a man of criminality is to rid him of freedom," which I think we can all agree is true, but we don't want to rid anyone of freedom. The chance of criminality is necessary for freedom. Our faces are unclouded by the insanity of thoughts. But we, people of today, we know all too well that dreaming is a serious mental disease. It is not your fault you are ill, and the name of your illness is fancy. Endless strings of people driven into the city to be saved by force. There's this thing called the Bureau of Guardians, which is like the police. And there's a line saying, "They lovingly guard you from making the most minute mistake." It's just so oppressive. The language in this is truly like a totalitarian guidebook. And now I'm going to talk about my absolute favourite aspect of this book, and that is the character development of D503. In the start of the book, he is like so indoctrinated to the system, like so much a believer of the system, and he writes fucking like the diary starts as just being like poems based on like maths. He's literally having like epiphanies about shapes and their relevance to the universe. And what I've come to expect in dystopian novels, where the character is like, you know, part of the regime and then goes against it, is a kind of slow realization that they don't agree, like intrinsically, like within them, they don't believe in what's happening anymore, and then they decide to go against it. And that's just not what happens here at all. What happens is that I-330 shocks him into it. When she first leads him off like the beaten path and takes him to the only opaque building in the whole city, which is like a museum homage to like history. They break the rules by staying there an extra hour or something, and he like really intends to like go report her to the Guardians. Despite being obviously really entranced by her, he is so steadfast to the rules. And then the next day he just kind of doesn't get round to it, and then he ends up not going, and he's like, oh, I'm a why didn't I do that? And as time goes on, he does more of these kind of like dissenting activities. He really like partitions himself into like one part of him that will believe anything that this woman says, and the other part of him that's like a good citizen of the one state. And he truly believes this rhetoric about him having a mental disease and, you know, feeling this split personality and wanting to check himself in for tests and be like, please take this inspiration, this fantasy out of me. But then he gets dragged further in and he falls so deeply in love that he can just like feel it within him as being something different. And yet he still has this split. Up to like a couple chapters before the end, he like wakes up and reads a newspaper by the state being like, hey, everything's okay, sort of thing. And he's like, oh, phew, like I've got over it and now everything's gonna be fine. He really believes that and just kind of ignores the part of him that is like so into the revolution. Towards the very end, where all of the numbers are encouraged to undergo this operation that will remove the fancy from them and all will be forgiven even if they, you know, slipped up a bit. D503 has what I think is the most like powerful moment in the book, where he says, I do not want salvation. It is the only time that he fully commits to not agreeing anymore. I do not want salvation. He's surrounded by other numbers that are like, yeah, we'll get the operation, then we'll all be saved and everything can go back to like perfect happiness. And he is like, no, I don't want salvation. I don't want perfection. I don't want homogeneity. I want conflict. I want reality. I want grit. I want to see what's beyond the wall. And although his character isn't really very outwardly passionate, it's really within this diary that he kind of explains all these intimate, you know, details in his mind. But I think that was just like the most profound sentiment expressed in the whole book, and it's so powerful. Anyway, you're gonna have to read it to find out what happens in the end. Let me warn you, this is dystopian fiction. Dystopian. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video on We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. I've really enjoyed making it. This is such a fun book to talk about and think about and engage with. So I hope you pick it up if you're interested. Tell me your thoughts if you've read it or if you read it in the future. I'd love to hear them. And thank you. I will see you for another video soon. Quick end note, I was just editing this video and realized I forgot to mention one of my favorite things and one of my favorite quotes, which is how D503 uses like poetry essentially. Like he's so poetic in like the mathematical terms he uses, especially when he's trying to relate them to things that he can't quite grasp yet, like love. There's this one bit that says, "My ribs were iron bars, the space for the heart was too small," which is, oh, it's so perfect and cute.